One of the intelligence failures, and I must say our failures, was that we did not take Sadat all that seriously. I had had two conversations, secret conversations with his national security advisor, one in France and one in the United States, in order to see whether we could get a peace process started. And we had intended to start one after the Israeli elections, which was scheduled for the end of October of that year. But Sadat, who had succeeded Nasser in 1970, had been threatening things for years. And in fact, when his security advisor met me the first time, he made a presentation at the end of which he said, if we succeed, the president will invite you to Cairo. And I wrote a little note to one of my associates sitting next to me, and I said, would it be impolite to ask him what the second prize is? So this was the political background. When I became Secretary of State, which was at the end of September, 2 weeks before the war started, I found out that the State Department had an intelligence research unit, which I had not been aware of. So I came in on the first Sunday that I was Secretary of State to read some of their reports. And I found that they were reporting that there was a concentration of Syrian divisions on the Golan Heights and of Egyptian divisions along the Suez Canal. And so I asked them what it meant. I asked the CIA what it meant. I asked the Israeli intelligence how they interpreted it. They all interpreted it as bluff and maneuvers that would not amount to anything. So I asked them to make a report every other day, every 2 days, to see. And every 2 days they reported the same thing. These divisions are still there. They're not doing anything particular. And so I went off to the UN. And this is why there's so much on the telephone, because I had to handle the first part of the crisis from New York. And right through, then on Thursday, I mean, I'm talking now about intelligence failures. On Thursday, the war started on a Saturday, Yom Kippur. On Thursday, we got a report that the Soviet dependents in Syria and Egypt were leaving the country. And we asked the intelligence people what that was due to. It said, well, there must be one of these quarrels between Arabs and Soviets. Nobody asked the question, who could be quarreling with the Arabs, with Syria and Egypt simultaneously, that would evoke this?
Synchronized anger.
So when that phone call came in at 6:15 in the morning, the first thing that Cisco, who brought me, he was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, Undersecretary for Political Affairs, when he came in, he said, if you get on this right away, were his first words to me, if you get on this right away, you'll get it under control. Well, by that time it was way out of control. The Egyptians were getting ready to go across the canal. The Israelis sent us a message saying, assure the Egyptians that we have no intention of attacking, so if they're attacking because they're afraid of us, there is no need. And the first, so I asked the emergency group in Washington, that was called Washington Special Action Group, to meet to assess that situation. And their assessment was that probably Israel was starting this, because the mindset was that this could not, that the Arabs were not in any position to start a war. So we spent, it can be traced in the book, the first 3 or 4 hours of the war analyzing who had started it. And the conversation with Abba Eban, where I say the Egyptians are telling us, I was talking to the Egyptian foreign minister and to the Soviets, and I said, the Egyptians are telling us you attacked in the Gulf with a naval operation, and I said, this is not your normal way of procedure, and he said, oh, no, but I don't know what's going on. So it wasn't until it started at 6, I would say it wasn't until about 11 that it was clear who had started it and the magnitude. And it took 2 more days before we and the Israelis realized that the Arab armies had actually scored a substantial success.
Let me ask
Convinced that it was a tragedy that the war had started, but that once the war had started, we should use this opportunity to see whether some progress could be made towards an Arab-Israeli negotiation. And therefore, we were convinced from the beginning that there would be a huge Israeli victory, and that was not at all clear for about 10 days. Israel was teetering very close to the edge of catastrophe for a while.
which was a surprise again.
Total surprise. So, of course, to them too, above all. So I said it's the objective immediately that we would attempt to restore the conditions when the war started, so that if Israel advanced, we would use our diplomatic influence to return them to the starting point. And we were asking the Soviets and others to support us at a time when the Arabs were gaining, to support a ceasefire resolution on the basis of the pre-war lines. That also had the advantage that it forced the Soviet Union into a very difficult position. They probably agreed with my analysis that Israel would win, but if they took our proposal and supported it, they would be telling their Arab allies that they had to give up territory that these allies considered their own, and which was not contested as being their own. And I had some painful conversations with the Egyptian foreign minister, said, how can you ask us to go back? But at any rate, this was a position that we had at the beginning, to which we could then return when the tide had turned, and that put us in the position where all the parties had to deal with us, and where our basic theme was, to the Arab side, you can make war with Soviet arms, but you have to make peace with American diplomacy. And this turned into a situation where we gradually then pushed the Soviet Union influence out of the Middle East, but it was.
I think the Soviet
The history was that the Soviets had, at one point, put 20,000 of their military personnel into the Suez area, and that the whole air defense of Egypt,
SAM missiles
there was a belt of SA-3 missiles, SA-2 and SA-3 missiles along the Suez Canal. And one reason why the Israelis suffered such heavy casualties was that their air force could not really operate along the Suez Canal because of the effectiveness of the Soviet established missile defense. Then Sadat kicked the Soviet military personnel out in the summer of '72. The Soviets were caught in a dilemma. They had the dominant position in Egypt and Syria when the war started. But they also were very eager to maintain good relations with us. And so under the détente policy that was then going on. So they were torn. They didn't want to give up their allies. They didn't want to give up the relationship. They probably knew that the war was going on, would happen. They didn't want to warn us. They claimed afterwards they pulled out their personnel to give us a warning, which we didn't catch. That may or may not be true. But I think the Soviet policy did not have a clear line during the crisis, and that was a great opportunity for us. They were encouraging, and they did start on the second or third day. They started an airlift of their own to help mostly Syria, but some into Egypt. I wanted to prevent two things. One, a huge crisis with the Soviet Union when the vice president was in the process of resigning, and Watergate was building up, and Vietnam had just been, at least temporarily, put behind us. And secondly, I wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from appearing as the protector of the Arab world and to split and to isolate us in the defense alone with Israel, with the European countries also opposed to us. And therefore, I tried to induce the Soviet Union to join us in some UN effort on a ceasefire, and I put forward that proposal, which would have required some Arab withdrawal in the first few days of the war. And I kept the Soviets rather well informed of what we were doing so that we could restore the military situation. At the same time, we were beginning almost immediately some military resupply of Israel, at the beginning primarily with high-tech equipment. And you remember, I have to repeat, the war started on a Saturday. We thought that by Wednesday, Israel would clearly have the upper hand. And so that all the maneuvers in the first week were designed to permit that situation to evolve so that we could then emerge as the mediator.
Right.
And that would reduce the Soviet the Soviet influence substantially, because the Soviet influence was based on military hardware. So, but then I had a shock because on Monday night, in the middle of the night, I had a call from the Israeli ambassador that he needed to see me urgently together with the military attaché, and that they wanted to come by the first thing in the morning, and I saw them in the White House. And the military attaché informed me that the Israelis had lost 400 tanks in 2 days, and I forget the number of airplanes, 30 or 40 airplanes, and that they needed urgent resupply. And and that Golda Meir wanted to come over to plead her case. I said, under no circumstances could Golda come over, because I thought that this would be a sign of such absolute panic that if the Prime Minister of Israel leaves Israel in the middle of a battle, then all the other Arab countries might jump into it, and the Soviet Union might begin to try to pick up the pieces, and that I would let him know by the afternoon what our reaction would be. And so we met during the day, President Nixon and advisors and myself, and we told the Israelis, well, we were shipping all along whatever the Israelis could carry on El Al airplanes. We told them we would replace all their losses, and therefore they did not have to hold anything back in their military operations. And but that it was essential, if we wanted to get a negotiation started, that they take some action in which they were not losing on every front. I mean, that was in essence which they were in the first few days.
They were,
As late as Wednesday, the Arab armies were still on territory that Israel had prior to the war. So this then started. So there were two separate questions. One was, could Israel count on resupply? That they could totally. Then how quickly could we get some resupply there? Now there, the difficulty was how was one going to ship, how was one going to send equipment, and was it going to appear fast enough? And we still thought at first that the battle would be essentially decided by what was there. So an attempt was made to charter airplanes and to use American government guarantees to charter airplanes and to fly equipment to Israel. And it would be too boring to go through all the details why that was not possible. The airlines did not want to charter planes. They did not want to lose business in the Arab world. It was difficult to get insurance. Then it turned out that it was difficult to get landing rights in the Azores. So about 36 hours were lost in getting the non-El Al air support, except we started flying planes. The airplanes we began to ship immediately because they could be flown there by refueling directly. Then on Friday night, it became clear that the Israeli offensive had been stalled, and that we had I have to back up for a minute. On the day after we had made this promise to the Israelis on resupply, the Soviets caught on to what was going on, and they were beginning to urge a ceasefire in place, which was the way each war had ended. And we stalled them for 3 days until hoping the military situation would be restored. But we finally said we'll trigger that diplomacy on Saturday. By Friday night, we decided that the best way that we couldn't wait anymore for charters, and we started an American, really military airlift into Israel, which is a highly unusual thing to fly an American military airlift into a combat zone.
You're also worried about how moderate Arab regimes might react,
Absolutely.
and you were looking for a provocation from the Soviets to allow you to go forward?
Well, you read the book very carefully. We were worried all along because Europe was in a panic about a possible oil cutoff. We also wanted, all along, our strategy in the Middle East had been based in part on Israel and in part on the moderate Arab countries. And we did not want the radicals to run wild as a result of an American airlift. So we maneuvered in some part on the ceasefire negotiations in such a way that it looked as if the Soviets had failed to deliver. And then, and it may not be all this attractive, our airlift was already going and had already been flying for 15 hours, but it took a while to get to Israel. So by the time we told the Soviets that we were doing an airlift, as a result of their transgressions, the fact was we had already started it. The fact was, whatever the formal diplomacy was, if we could not get a negotiated outcome then, one had to wait until there was a clear-cut military decision. And so then the second week was spent on waiting that clear-cut military decision to emerge. The Egyptians made a military mistake of moving 2 of their armor divisions outside the protection of their missile defense. So they lost in one day 300 tanks of their own to the Israeli Air Force. And then the battle turned entirely, and the Israelis...
not always with the help of Golda Meir.
No, there were 2 aspects to this. The first was the Israelis scored a big victory by going across the canal and in effect tearing up that missile defense shield. Then an urgent ceasefire was made. I was in Moscow. I flew from Moscow to Tel Aviv to symbolize our continued interest in Israel and to work out the exact hour of the ceasefire. And unbelievable as it may be, here's Cairo and Jerusalem, 500 miles apart. It took us an hour or so to figure out the time difference because there was no. So anyway, this was done, and when it was done, I left. And on the way back, while I was in the air, the Israelis jumped off again and trapped the Egyptian Third Army, which had not been trapped before. And so I arrived back in Washington thinking we had a ceasefire, and the Egyptian Third Army had been trapped. Now, we had maneuvered against the Soviet Union, but we did not want to inflict a total humiliation of going to Moscow, going to Tel Aviv, making it look as if America colluded in this maneuver. And I did not think it was either in the interest of Israel to have to destroy the Third Army, which could fairly easily be reconstituted with Soviet military help, and overthrow Sadat. By that time, I had developed a respect for Sadat because during the war, which I should have mentioned earlier, during the war, from the first day of the war on, he and I exchanged messages. And even while we were resupplying Israel, I would send him messages saying, now remember, you will need us when this war is over, and please conduct whatever you're doing in such a way as to make it possible for an American peace offensive or peace process to start. And he never unleashed the mob against us the way NASA had in '67. So for all of these reasons, we thought that a solution had to be found to the problem of the Third Army. Before we could turn to the solution, the Soviet Union threatened to send troops.
They got really angry when they found out they'd been had, didn't they?
Well, yes, we did not. We did not conduct our diplomacy in order to.
No, I understand.
To trick them. We wanted gradually to push them out, but they were very angry to have me there, go back via Tel Aviv, and then so they sent us a message. It was on a Wednesday night that they moved massive naval forces into the Middle East, into the Mediterranean, and they sent us a message threatening, saying that they and we should send a joint military force, in effect, against the Israeli trapping of the Third Army, and that if we did not join them, they would go alone. And they had stood down 10 of their 12 airborne divisions, which is a sign of mobilization. And so we did not respond to this message until we had put our military forces into a state of sufficient alert to be noticed by Soviet intelligence, and then we replied. And then the Soviets pulled back and said it was enough if we each sent 50 observers. And we cut that down to 20 before it was over. But then this was Thursday. So Friday, what I urged the Israelis to do was to permit a convoy of food, water, and medicine to go to the Third Army, but otherwise keep the positions as they were, keep the Third Army trapped, but not starve them to death. And this the Israelis, by one means or another, managed to avoid doing. And so comes Friday, we get a message from the Russians that a hotline message was coming. And that usually means it gets there within 5 minutes. That's why it's called the hotline. And in fact, it turned out that we didn't get one for 4 hours, so we thought, here we're building into another crisis. And so we decided that we could not have a nuclear crisis every 48 hours on an issue which needed to be resolved in everybody's interest in the way we had proposed. So we sent a message to the Israelis saying, we sent a message to the Egyptians urging direct talks between Israel and Egypt, which had never happened before. And we sent a message to the Israelis that if by 8 o'clock the next morning they had not let that convoy through, we would have to vote against them in the UN. There were groups in our government who wanted to resupply the Third Army with American airplanes, which I opposed. Well, I can assure you, we got a message from Golda Meir, which was not exactly friendly in response to this. And while these exchanges were going on, the Egyptians accepted our proposal to have direct negotiations with Israel. And that started another minor crisis, because there was, well, shall we say kindly, a misunderstanding as to exactly where they were going to meet. And that was finally solved. And so after the smoke cleared, the convoy went to the Third Army. There were the first direct talks between Egypt and Israel, and out of this 3 agreements emerged, culminating in the peace agreement.
Golda could be a pretty colorful character. What was it she said to you about we're only a tiny little nation?
Well, you know, here we had run an airlift, which is not the usual thing. We'd run an airlift, we'd resupplied them, we'd gone on nuclear alert. So we had certainly shown our support. And she said, well, we're just a little country. And if you want to tell her, if you and the Russians want to agree among each other about our fate, when all we asked her to do was to send one convoy with food and water through lines that would continue to be controlled. But on the other hand, I adored Golda. And she was tough, she was heroic, she was stubborn, but she also had, when she understood the necessities, she fought for them with great courage, and I think she's one of the most remarkable people that I've met.